6 years ago, I broke up with a man because I was embarrassed to tell my friends he spent his afternoons washing cars for a living. I called him a dead end, told him he needed to grow up and get a real career, and walked away feeling like I'd made the responsible choice. Last month, I walked into a luxury dealership to buy myself a birthday present, and the name on the glass office door in the back, the owner's name, stopped me cold in the middle of the showroom floor. It was his name. He hadn't been washing cars because that was all he could do. He'd been washing cars in the exact dealership his own family had built, learning the business from the ground up, the way his father had insisted every future owner had to, and I had walked away from all of it because I couldn't see past a soapy sponge and a pair of work gloves. Welcome back to Betrayal Stories. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because every week we bring you real stories about the people we underestimate and the moments that force us to face exactly how wrong we were. My name is Megan Foster, and this is the story of the biggest mistake I ever made, and the dealership floor where I finally had to stand in it. I need to start this story by being honest about the kind of person I was at 24, because I think it's the only way this whole thing makes sense. I grew up in a family where status mattered, quietly but constantly, the kind of household where my father, a partner at a regional law firm, would ask new boyfriends what they did within the first 10 minutes of meeting them, and where my mother kept a running, unspoken scorecard of which of her friends' children had married well and which hadn't. I absorbed that scorecard mentality without ever fully realizing it, the way you absorb an accent from the place you grew up, so natural you don't notice you have one until you leave and someone points it out. I met Ethan Brooks this summer after I finished my business degree, at a mutual friend's barbecue, and I was drawn to him almost immediately, in a way that had nothing to do with any of my family's usual metrics. He was funny in this quiet, understated way, the kind of humor that snuck up on you a beat after he said something rather than landing immediately. He was a genuinely good listener, the rare kind who asked follow-up questions because he actually wanted to know the answer, not because he was waiting for his turn to talk. We started dating within a few weeks, and for the first several months, I was happier than I think I'd ever been in a relationship before. The complication started when I asked him, fairly early on, what he did for work. Ethan told me, simply and without any obvious embarrassment, that he worked at his family's car dealership, doing detailing and cleaning, prepping vehicles for the showroom floor and for delivery to customers. I remember my first internal reaction, one I'm not proud of now, being a small, involuntary flicker of disappointment, because in the mental shorthand I'd absorbed growing up, cleans cars for a living did not sound like the kind of answer that would impress my father at a family dinner. I want to be clear that Ethan never once presented his job as something bigger or fancier than it was. He never dropped hints about family wealth, never mentioned anything about ownership or management, never behaved, in any way, like a man secretly sitting on more than he was letting on. He talked about his work the way anyone talks about an honest job, mentioning long days, difficult customers, the satisfaction of a car looking perfect before a big delivery. If anything, looking back now, his consistency and total lack of pretension should have told me something important about his character. At the time, all I could hear was car cleaner, and all I could think about was how that sentence would sound coming out of my mouth at my parents' dinner table. For the first several months, I simply avoided the topic around my friends and family, which in itself should have told me something about how I actually felt, deep down, about the relationship I was supposedly building. When my mother asked what Ethan did, I'd say something vague. He works in the auto industry, technically true, strategically incomplete. When my friends asked, during a group dinner about 6 months into dating him, I remember actually feeling my face get hot when someone pressed for details, and hearing myself say, he works at a dealership, kinda behind the scenes stuff, in a tone that I now recognize, with real discomfort, was designed specifically to downplay and obscure rather than to honestly represent the man I was supposedly falling in love with. Ethan noticed the vagueness, of course, because he wasn't a fool, and about 8 months into our relationship, he brought it up directly, sitting across from me at a quiet dinner, asking, gently but plainly, if I was embarrassed by what he did for a living. I remember lying to him in that moment, telling him no, of course not, that I just didn't think our relationship was anyone else's business to dissect over polite conversation. He didn't push it further that night, but I could tell, even then, that some small part of him had registered the lie for exactly what it was. The actual breakup happened about 10 months into the relationship, at what should have been a fairly ordinary family dinner. My father, in his usual direct way, asked Ethan point blank what his career plans were, whether he intended to stay in car detailing long term or whether he had ambitions to move into something with more of a future. I watched Ethan answer honestly and calmly, saying that he was actually quite happy with the path he was on, that there was a lot more to the auto business than people assumed from the outside, and that he was building towards something he genuinely believed in. I remember feeling, in that exact moment, a wave of something close to panic, watching my father's expression shift into the particular kind of polite, dismissive skepticism he reserved for answers he considered beneath serious consideration. After Ethan left that night, my father pulled me aside and said, not unkindly but firmly, that he thought I could do better, that a smart, ambitious young woman like me shouldn't settle for a man with no real career trajectory, no matter how nice he seemed at dinner. I want to own, completely and without excuse, what happened next, because this is the part of the story I'm least proud of, and also the part that matters most. I broke up with Ethan 2 weeks later, and I didn't do it kindly. I told him, during that final conversation, that I needed to be with someone who had real ambition, someone building toward an actual future rather than spending his days scrubbing leather seats and vacuuming floor mats. I told him, and I remember this sentence leaving my mouth with a clarity that still makes me wince, that he needed to figure out what he actually wanted to do with his life instead of hiding out in a job that clearly wasn't leading anywhere. Ethan didn't argue with me that night, didn't defend himself, didn't try to correct whatever assumptions I was operating on. He just looked at me for a long moment, nodded slowly, and said something I didn't fully understand until years later. He said, "You should probably ask more questions before you decide you already know the whole answer." Then he left, and I didn't hear from him again for 6 years. I want to be honest about the years in between, because I think they matter to understanding how completely I'd convinced myself that breaking up with Ethan had been the right, mature decision. About a year after the breakup, I started dating Preston Callahan, a man who checked every box my family's unspoken scorecard had ever cared about, an investment banker from a well-established family, the kind of resume that made my father visibly relax the first time they shook hands. Preston and I got engaged after 2 years together, and I remember feeling, during that engagement, a genuine sense of having finally arrived at the kind of life I was supposed to build, the kind of partnership that would make sense to everyone around me. That engagement fell apart about 8 months before the wedding, for reasons that, looking back now, mirror almost exactly the mistake I'd made with Ethan, just from the opposite direction. Preston, it turned out, had built an entire life around exactly the kind of surface-level achievement my family had always valued, without much of the substance underneath that actually makes a relationship sustainable. He was controlling about my career choices, dismissive of my opinions in ways that had somehow read as confidence during our early dating and revealed themselves as something much less flattering once we were planning an actual shared life together. I ended that engagement myself, and spent the following 2 years working through, in therapy, exactly how much of my relationship history had been shaped by a scorecard I'd inherited rather than genuinely chosen for myself. By the time I turned 30, about 5 years after the breakup with Ethan, I had done enough of that internal work to recognize, uncomfortably, that the biggest mistake in my dating history hadn't been Preston. It had been walking away from a genuinely kind, funny, attentive man because I'd been embarrassed by a job title. Without ever once asking him a real question about what that job actually involved, what his actual goals were, or what the auto business he'd mentioned that night at dinner might have actually meant beyond the narrow assumption I'd already decided was the entire truth. I thought about reaching out to Ethan more than once during those years, mostly to apologize, genuinely, for how I'd treated him, not because I expected anything to come of it romantically, but because the way that final conversation had ended had sat with me, uncomfortably, for years. I never actually followed through, partly out of a lingering embarrassment about facing him again, and partly because I genuinely had no idea where he was or what he was doing with his life anymore. Last month, about 6 years after that breakup, I decided to treat myself to something significant for my 30th birthday, a car I'd been saving toward for almost 2 years, a genuine milestone purchase that felt like a marker of everything I'd rebuilt in my life since the mess of my late 20s. I did my research, found a luxury dealership across town with excellent reviews and a strong reputation for straightforward, low-pressure sales, and made an appointment to look at a few models the following Saturday. I want to describe walking into that showroom, because I think the details matter to how completely unprepared I was for what happened next. It was a genuinely beautiful space, gleaming floors, cars arranged like sculptures under warm, deliberate lighting, the kind of environment clearly designed to make an expensive purchase feel like an experience rather than a transaction. A salesperson greeted me warmly, walked me through a few models that fit what I was looking for, and at one point, while I was sitting in the driver's seat of a car I was seriously considering, mentioned, almost in passing, that the owner liked to personally check in with customers making significant purchases. If I didn't mind him stopping by briefly. I said that was fine, genuinely more focused on the car in front of me than on meeting some dealership owner I assumed would be a pleasant, forgettable interaction. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps approaching, and a voice that hit something deep and immediate in my memory before I'd even turned my head to look. I turned, and there was Ethan Brooks, 6 years older, dressed in a genuinely well-tailored suit, looking exactly like himself but also entirely unlike the man I remembered, standing in the middle of a showroom that, I would learn over the next hour, he had owned outright for the past 3 years. I don't fully remember what I said in that first moment, some combination of shock and his name and probably something incoherent about not expecting to see him there. Ethan, to his enormous credit, handled the moment with far more grace than I think I would have managed in his position. He smiled, genuinely warm despite everything, and said something like, "Megan, it's been a long time," before gesturing toward his office in the back of the showroom and asking if I wanted to sit down for a few minutes, for old time's sake, before continuing with my car search. Sitting in that office, surrounded by awards and photographs I hadn't had time to fully process yet, Ethan told me the full story, calmly, without any apparent bitterness, though I imagine he had every right to feel some. His family had owned that dealership, and 2 others across the state, for almost 30 years, built originally by his grandfather and expanded by his father into a genuinely significant regional business. Ethan's father, however, held a very particular philosophy about how the business should eventually pass to the next generation, one rooted in a hard lesson from his own father's era, when a previous heir to the family business had been handed management responsibility without ever actually understanding the ground-level operations, and had nearly run the entire dealership into the ground within 5 years through decisions that looked reasonable on paper but ignored basic realities the staff could have explained in a heartbeat. And once over the years, what might have happened if I had asked him one more question that night at dinner, instead of deciding I already had the whole picture? I bought the car that day, from a different salesperson, because Ethan, appropriately, stepped back from directly handling the transaction himself. Before I left, he did tell me, without any real expectation attached to it, that he appreciated me being honest about everything in that conversation, and that he genuinely hoped I was doing well, wherever my own life had ended up. We haven't spoken since that afternoon, and I don't think we will, not out of lingering hostility on either side, but simply because 6 years and one deeply revealing conversation is not, realistically, a foundation for rebuilding something that ended the way it did. I think about that conversation constantly now, weeks later, not because I'm holding on to some fantasy about what might have been, but because it forced me to confront, in the clearest possible terms, exactly how much of my 20s I spent evaluating people through a scorecard I never actually chose for myself, inherited instead from a household where status mattered more than character, where a job title carried more weight in a first impression than genuine kindness, patience, or integrity ever did. Ethan wasn't washing cars because that was the extent of his ambition. He was washing cars because he came from a family wise enough to understand that real leadership has to be built from the ground up, earned through unglamorous, patient work rather than handed over based on last name alone. And I walked away from a genuinely good man, during exactly the period of his life when he was quietly proving, through actual daily labor, exactly the kind of character that should matter far more than any job title ever could, because I was too busy worrying about how that job title would sound at a family dinner. I've spent the week since that dealership visit doing a lot of hard, honest reflection about the scorecard I inherited and the version of myself I want to actually choose going forward, rather than the version shaped entirely by other people's assumptions about what success and worthiness are supposed to look like. I don't know if I'll ever get the chance to properly make amends to Ethan for how I treated him, and I'm not sure that's actually the point anymore. The point, I think, is making sure I never again mistake someone's willingness to do humble, honest work for a lack of ambition, and never again let a title or a paycheck stand in for the much harder, much more important work of actually getting to know who someone really is. If you've ever misjudged someone completely, only to find out the full truth much later, I want to hear about it. Tell me your story in the comments below. And if this story kept you hooked from beginning to end, make sure you subscribe to Betrayal Stories so you never miss the next one. We've got a lot more coming, and some of these stories will make you rethink people you thought you already understood completely. See you in the next video.